Imagine living in a city that's always been noisy. You know, a place defined by the heavy rumble of factories, the constant churn of traffic, the sounds of heavy industry. You kind of accept that noise. It's just the pulse of daily life.
Right, it's the background hum, literally.
Exactly. But then, sometime around 2011, this new sound starts. And it isn't loud, not really, but it's everywhere. A relentless, deep drone. It's like this invisible pressure that you feel, not so much in your ears, but deep in your chest, in your bones. And it just torments you night after night. Welcome to Paskvan Podcasts. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps this channel.
Yeah, and that invisible torment, that became the reality for thousands of people in Windsor, Ontario.
Yeah.
A city already used to noise pollution, like you said, suddenly found itself dealing with something, well, much stranger. This untraceable vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once.
And this wasn't just, an annoying sound. It blew up into this huge civic mystery. We're talking a decade of psychological suffering, scientific investigations hitting dead ends, and even, tense international politics getting involved.
Absolutely. It touched everything.
So our goal here is to really unpack the story of the Windsor Hum. We'll dig into the source materials, the personal stories, the official reports, to understand the search for an unseen intruder that basically held a whole community hostage.
Going beyond just the headlines to see the real human cost
Yeah.
and the frustration of trying to solve something you can't quite pin down.
Okay, so when we talk about the Windsor Hum, the first thing that strikes me is the sensory weirdness. It was the sound people experienced very intensely, but often. It wouldn't even register properly on standard recording gear.
Right.
It was always described as this low droning vibration. People kept saying it was more felt than heard. Why is that distinction, felt versus heard, so key to understanding what was going on?
Well, that distinction tells us right away we're probably dealing with something at the very bottom edge of human hearing,
Okay.
deep in the low frequency spectrum. We're likely talking about infrasound.
Infrasound.
Yeah, infrasound waves are these vibrations below, say, 20 hertz, sometimes way down, just a few hertz. And the waves are so slow, the inner ear doesn't really interpret them as the distinct pitch, like a musical note. Instead, the body experiences them as, well, pressure, vibration, maybe even a sense of movement, rather than just sound.
Ah, okay. So when residents compared it to an idling diesel engine running just outside the house, even when the street was totally empty, or like distant thunder that never faded, they weren't actually hearing a truck.
Exactly. They weren't hearing it in the usual way. They were sensing these slow air pressure waves moving through their homes, through the structures.
That makes sense.
And unlike normal noise pollution, which kind of bounces off things or fades away, these low-frequency waves, they travel incredibly long distances. And they can penetrate solid stuff walls, windows, with very little loss of energy.
Which explains why earplugs were totally useless.
Completely useless. And why it felt like the vibration was coming from inside the house walls themselves. There's this one really chilling report describing it as machinery running constantly underground. You couldn't see it, but it was fundamentally changing the feeling of the environment, making everything seem, I don't know, unnatural, deeply unsettling.
And the worst part, it sounds like, was just how constant it was. It wasn't necessarily loud enough to stop you having a conversation. You could talk over it, watch TV.
Right, it wasn't deafening.
But it was just always there, that relentless, low vibration, just grinding people down day after day, night after night.
That constancy, yeah, that's the absolute key to why it was so destructive. Our bodies, our brains, we rely on periods of quiet, for restoration. But the hum offered zero reprieve. None. So the brain was kind of stuck in this permanent state of low-level alarm.
That sounds exhausting.
Totally. And crucially, it was always most noticeable at night. During the day, the regular city sounds traffic, maybe nearby factories, they'd sort of mask it a bit.
Right, the normal background noise.
But once those faded away,
Yeah.
that deep fundamental drone just took over the quiet. It invaded the very time when people needed deep, restful sleep the most. Hashtag 1.2. The psychological toll and physical symptoms, and the effects people reported. I mean, looking through the public records, the medical assessments, it goes way beyond just being annoyed or losing a bit of sleep.
Right.
This vibration triggered really severe, debilitating symptoms, the kind you see with chronic exposure to serious environmental stressors. We're talking about headaches that just wouldn't quit, lasting for days sometimes.
Wow.
A constant low-grade irritability that just frayed everyone's nerves. It directly led to strained relationships, family arguments. Just imagine living with that constant tension.
And the physical stuff was pretty systemic too, wasn't it? Nausea comes up a lot, and this really strange feeling of heavy pressure in the chest. How does that physical sensation link back to the physics of low-frequency sound?
Yeah, that really gets to the core of how infrasound works. The longer the wavelength of the sound wave, the more likely it is to actually interact with the natural resonant frequencies of the human body itself.
Resonant frequencies, like how a wine glass shatters?
Sort of, yeah. Parts of our body, the eye sockets, the chest cavity, even some internal organs, they have their own natural frequencies they vibrate at, and some of those fall right within that infrasound range, like 1 to 20 hertz.
Okay.
So when the hum vibrated at that specific frequency, residents weren't just hearing it with their ears. Their actual bodies were vibrating internally in sympathy with the sound wave.
Oh, that's disturbing.
It is. And that's likely what produced that feeling of an invisible weight, like a physical compression, or the nausea. It suggests a genuine, systemic physical reaction to the vibration itself.
And that constant physical stress combined with the lack of sleep, it really started to wear people down mentally.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Resilience just collapses when you can't get true restorative rest. Experts who looked at this started saying that the inability to escape this invisible tormentor, plus the physical stress, it actually began to mimic the psychological effects of white torture.
White torture.
Yes, type of psychological torture, using relentless, inescapable sensory pressure like constant light or constant sound to break prisoners. The hum, because it was invisible and you couldn't get away from it, it kind of achieved a similar effect, almost accidentally. It robbed people of that basic feeling of peace and security in their own homes.
And then there was that other really isolating aspect, the divided household thing.
Oh, yeah. That was brutal.
The records show one partner could be absolutely tormented all night by the vibration, feeling the windows rattle, feeling that chest pressure, while the other person is sleeping like a baby right next to them, completely oblivious.
Completely oblivious, often even dismissing it, saying, "What are you talking about? I don't feel anything."
That must have been incredibly frustrating and damaging. How did that inconsistency play out in the bigger picture?
It was devastating for those suffering. It fueled so much skepticism from neighbors, sometimes the local media, even public officials early on. If your own spouse couldn't hear or feel it, it made your suffering seem subjective, like maybe it was all in your head.
Right, it feeds the psychosomatic argument.
Exactly. So for the people being tormented, that lack of validation from others just compounded the anxiety. It made their struggle feel totally isolating. And it definitely fueled arguments about whether the hum was even real. That division, that doubt, it was almost like another weapon the hum used to break people down psychologically. Hashtag, tag 1.3, the growing public frustration, 2011.
So as 2011 progressed, this wasn't just scattered complaints anymore. The quiet suffering started turning into a real public outcry.
Yeah, the volume just got too loud to ignore. Too many people were saying the same thing.
Local media, especially radio call-in shows and maybe online forums, they basically became collection points for all these stories from exhausted residents, right?
They really did. And the power was in the consistency of the stories. It didn't matter which neighborhood you were in downtown Windsor. Out in the eastern suburbs, everyone described the same things. That low-frequency drone, that feeling of mechanical vibration you couldn't escape.
That must have validated things for people, hearing others describe the exact same weird experience.
Hugely validating. It forced the city council eventually to see this wasn't just a few isolated cranks complaining about noise. It was a shared civic nightmare.
There was that one quote that kept popping up. It's like living next to a giant diesel engine that never shuts off.
That quote really captured the feeling.
Yeah.
And we saw reports of people literally walking the streets in the middle of the night, desperate, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from.
Only to come home defeated.
Exactly. Defeated. And the moment they stepped back inside, they'd feel that deep tremor return. People were convinced there had to be some huge hidden machinery operating nearby. They could even feel their house walls sort of quiver.
That combination sounds awful, being so sure something's wrong, but completely helpless to find it or stop it.
It was toxic. The consistency of the descriptions told them, okay, I'm not crazy. But the fact that nobody, not neighbors, not officials, not early investigators, could actually locate the source, that just cranked up the anxiety. If all our modern tech and local knowledge couldn't find this thing, maybe it would never stop.
Yeah, that fear must have been palpable.
It led to this feeling of collective helplessness. And that's when the demands for serious political action really started to mount. People needed answers. They needed someone to do something.
Okay, so by 2012, the city council couldn't really ignore it anymore. The pressure was just too intense. You read about these council meetings being packed with just weary residents demanding answers.
Yeah, the accounts are quite moving. You had retirees, single mothers, factory workers standing up and basically confessing they had abandoned parts of their own homes,
Yeah.
bedrooms, living rooms, just to get a few hours of relief from the vibration.
Wow. Just gave up rooms.
Yeah. So the pressure on the elected officials, it was huge. Very public, very emotional.
So the city had to act. They commissioned acoustic studies, right? Brought in engineers with specialized gear.
They did. That was the logical first step. They brought in acoustic engineers armed with really sensitive monitoring equipment. The plan seemed straightforward enough, scatter these sensors across the affected areas of the city.
Try and triangulate it, like finding the source of a radio signal.
Exactly, that was the goal.
Yeah.
Triangulate the source, pinpoint the direction the low-frequency sound was coming from.
But the sources we looked at basically described this initial effort as, well, a total failure, a maddening inconsistency. What made the hum so damn hard for the scientific equipment to actually pin down?
Well, there were a couple of big problems, really. It came down to physics and the environment itself. First off, just measuring these really low frequencies accurately is technically pretty tricky. The wavelengths are huge, physically very long. So you need specialized microphones, very careful calibration. Your standard sound meter often just filters out these deep subsonic frequencies because they're not what we normally care about for noise ordinances.
Okay, so the tools weren't always right for the job.
Partly. And second, the environment of a place like Windsor. It's a heavy industrial city right next to another heavy industrial city, Detroit. It's already filled with ambient low-frequency noise. Think trucks braking on the bridge, trains miles away, factory rumbles.
Right, a lot of background noise in that same low range.
Exactly. So the sensors were picking up weird intermittent spikes at very low frequencies, sometimes down around 10 hertz, really low. But the spikes just never lined up properly. They didn't behave like a signal from a single fixed source.
What were they expecting to see?
They expected a clear signal that would get weaker logically as you moved further away, right? So you could draw these circles on a map converging on one point. But instead, the hum would flare up really strongly in one neighborhood one night.
And then the next night, it'd be weak there, but blasting somewhere else.
Precisely. It was all over the place. The scientists themselves started describing it as chasing a ghost. Something clearly real enough to make people sick.
But too slippery to actually capture with the instruments.
Yeah. The data was just frustratingly variable. And they realized things like weather temperature inversions, wind direction, even humidity could dramatically affect how sound, especially low-frequency sound, travels across that big open space of the Detroit River.
Ah, so the river and the weather were messing with the signals.
It seemed like it. They weren't dealing with a simple, stable source point. It was more like a wave that was bending, bouncing, maybe getting amplified by weird atmospheric conditions or the shape of the land and water. And because they couldn't get clean, consistent data, they had no objective proof, no coordinates they could take to regulators or politicians and say, look, this is where it's coming from. Hashtag tag 2.2 theories multiplied in the absence of data.
And that's classic, isn't it? When the official science can't give you a clear answer, speculation just floods in to fill the gap.
Oh, absolutely. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does public anxiety.
Initially, the suspicion turned inwards, right? Towards Windsor's own industries.
That's the standard playbook. You look in your own backyard first. They definitely targeted the big local sources of vibration. The Ford engine plant, the Chrysler minivan plant, the big shipping yards along the river, the main rail lines. These places obviously generate a lot of constant deep rumble.
Makes sense.
The problem was ruling them out. Well, yeah, these places definitely contribute to the city's overall low-frequency background noise. None of their specific operational patterns seemed to match the hum's sudden appearance around 2011 or why it was so erratic. It didn't quite fit.
So if it wasn't local industry, the scope widened. People started thinking about geological stuff. What kind of Earth-based ideas were floating around?
These theories were kind of appealing because they could potentially explain why the sound felt so pervasive, so fundamental, like it was coming from the ground itself.
Right.
People speculated about natural resonance, maybe something to do with the Detroit River interacting with specific underground rock formations, or maybe actual shifts in the Earth, creating huge underground caverns that could act like giant natural amplifiers for distant sounds.
I remember seeing mention of microseismic activity. That sounds serious, but what does it actually mean in this context?
Yeah, microseismic activity basically refers to really, really faint ground motions or tremors. They're usually way below the level of what we'd call an earthquake. Seismographs might pick them up, but they're normally just background chatter.
Okay.
The theory here was maybe these continuous, almost imperceptible shifts in the bedrock were being felt by humans as this low vibration. And since geological stuff is naturally variable, that could maybe explain why the hum came and went.
Plausible, maybe.
Plausible, but really hard to prove convincingly. Connecting those super subtle Earth movements directly to the severe physical symptoms people were reporting, that was a big leap scientifically.
And then, of course, when you have no hard evidence, the really dramatic theories start to take hold. Conspiracy theories, secret government projects.
Yeah, that's where things got pretty wild. The hum being invisible, untraceable, and making people physically ill. It was like the perfect storm for conspiracy theories.
What kind of things were people suggesting?
Oh, you heard everything. Experiments with low-frequency radar systems, maybe for detecting stealth aircraft, secret submarine communication arrays sending signals through the Great Lakes, even clandestine sonic weapons being tested across the border.
Wow. People even brought up HARP, didn't they? The research program in Alaska.
They did, which is interesting because HARP actually studies the ionosphere using high-frequency radio waves, completely different physics.
Why link it to a low-frequency hum in Windsor?
It's more about what HARP represents in the public imagination, I think. It's this mysterious, powerful government facility often linked in popular lore to weather control or large-scale atmospheric stuff. Even though the science doesn't match at all, the public anxiety about some unseen, powerful force at play made it a convenient villain.
Just grab onto any explanation, however unlikely.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And theories about mass mind control or advanced sonic tech really took root. Especially because of that factor we talked about, that not everyone could hear or feel the hum. That fueled the idea that it wasn't just simple sound waves, but maybe some kind of targeted interaction between technology and individual human bodies.
Okay, so despite all the wild theories, the local suspects, one place really started to dominate people's thinking in Windsor, Zug Island. It's right across the Detroit River in the U.S., an incredibly heavy industrial site. Can you paint a picture of what Zug Island is like, visually and operationally?
Zug Island is. Well, it's visually overwhelming. It sits there on the southern edge of Detroit, and people in Windsor described it looking like something out of a dystopian painting. It's just packed with polluting, heavy industry. We're talking major steel production, these huge roaring blast furnaces, massive coke ovens, and they run 24/7.
So people in Windsor could literally see it across the water, the stacks, the smoke.
Oh, yeah. They could see the glowing stacks at night, the plumes of smoke during the day, and they could definitely hear the distant, constant rumble of massive machinery. It's an imposing presence.
So when this weird hum started, that massive nonstop operation right across the river must have seemed like the incredibly obvious culprit.
It was the prime suspect, absolutely. It just made intuitive sense. And did the limited acoustic studies, the ones that had trouble pinpointing things, did they offer any support for the Zug Island theory?
They did offer some cautious support. Remember how inconsistent the data was?
Like chasing the ghost.
Well, amidst that inconsistency, the engineers did find that some specific low-frequency patterns they recorded in Windsor, particularly these periodic rumbles, seemed to show some correlation with the big operational cycles over on Zug Island, especially during peak times for coke production and steel processing.
Ah, so there was a faint signal pointing that way.
A faint signal, yeah. And the geography played a huge role too, right? The river wasn't blocking the sound.
No, quite the opposite. The Detroit River, instead of acting like a sound barrier, seemed to function more like an acoustic channel. Water is actually really good at transmitting low-frequency vibrations.
Better than air.
Much better over distance. And the open space above the water, especially under certain weather conditions like those temperature inversions we mentioned, seemed to funnel the noise directly from the island's furnaces and machinery right into Windsor's neighborhoods on the other side.
So for the people suffering in Windsor, the connection felt almost undeniable. Their misery finally had a name, an address, a visible source they could point their finger at.
Exactly. It gave their suffering a focus, an obvious culprit, even if proving it scientifically was proving difficult. Hashtag 3.2 diplomatic friction and accountability. But as soon as suspicion really locked onto Zug Island, the whole problem shifted gears. It wasn't just about acoustics anymore. It became an international political issue.
Because Zug Island is in the U.S.
Entirely within U.S. jurisdiction, which created this incredibly complex jurisdictional nightmare. The city of Windsor, or even the Canadian federal government, had absolutely no legal authority to force the companies on Zug Island to do anything, No power to regulate them, inspect them, or even demand consistent monitoring of their noise output.
Wow. So what happened when Canadian officials, city folks, federal folks first tried to talk to their counterparts in Michigan? What kind of response did they get?
Well, the response was described as uh, tepid at best,
Yeah.
often pretty resistant. Windsor officials tried again and again to open up lines of communication. They sent over the technical data they had, bundles of resident testimonies.
And the U.S. side? Michigan, the EPA?
They acknowledged the complaints, sure, but they kept stressing that before they could compel these private companies on Zug Island to make expensive changes or even conduct thorough investigations, they needed clear, definitive, reproducible evidence.
Which was the exact thing the scientists couldn't provide because the hum was so inconsistent.
Exactly. It was a perfect catch-22. Canada needed proof to get the U.S. to act, but the U.S. wouldn't act to help gather the proof.
And the companies on Zug Island themselves, what was their position?
They made the situation even worse by just flatly denying any responsibility. Their public line was basically, hey, our equipment's been running like this for decades without any major complaints. This hum must be something else. Maybe it's weather, maybe it's geology, maybe Windsor has its own noise problem they're blaming on us.
So you had corporate denial backed up by this jurisdictional wall. That must have created some serious diplomatic tension.
Intense friction. You had Canadian officials essentially arguing that American industry was directly harming the health and well-being of Canadian citizens. But because of the complexities of cross-border bureaucracy, getting any real action was incredibly slow.
It sounds like just endless bureaucracy while people were still suffering.
That's pretty much what it was. A slow, painful grind of exchanging letters, holding international committee meetings, constantly requesting new data that was hard to get, all while the hum just kept going year after year. That political gridlock, that feeling of powerlessness, was probably almost as psychologically damaging as the sound itself for the residents. It showed them their own government couldn't really protect them from this invisible attacker from across the border.
But even with Zug Island being the prime suspect, that scientific puzzle still lingered, didn't it? If the island was definitely the cause, why did the hum fluctuate so much? And why did it only seem to become a major problem around 2011 if the factories had been there for ages?
That was the constant nagging question, the rebuttal from skeptics and the companies themselves. People tried to explain it. Maybe there were subtle changes in how the island operated. Maybe they cranked up the blast furnace temperatures or changed the timing of the coke production cycle, altering the specific frequencies just enough to start impacting Windsor differently.
Or maybe something changed in the environment.
Yeah. Others theorized maybe small changes in the Detroit riverbed itself had altered how the sound resonated or traveled. But regardless of the theory, that underlying uncertainty, it meant the problem never got fully resolved. It remained this sore point politically and, frankly, a bit of an embarrassment scientifically.
Let's circle back to the human cost again, because it was immense. We touched on the psychological impact, but the sources describe the hum as almost bypassing the ears entirely, worming its way directly into the body. That sounds incredibly invasive. How did that sensation make it impossible to escape?
Well, when a sound is so low that you feel it internally, like we discussed with resonance, then all the usual ways you'd block out noise just fail. Earplugs. Useless. White noise machines. The hum just vibrated right through them. Even moving to a different room often didn't help because the sound wasn't just coming through the air, it was transmitting structurally through the building itself and physiologically through your own body.
Wow.
One resident described it perfectly as a slow invasion. This feeling that something was fundamentally wrong not just outside, but inside the very structure of their home, and maybe even inside their own nervous system.
And this led people to take really drastic measures. We read accounts of families literally selling their homes, often at a huge financial loss, just desperate to get away from it.
Absolutely. People uprooted their lives. Relationships fractured under the sheer, unrelenting pressure of irritability and chronic sleep deprivation. The clinical picture is one of chronic stress morphing into sustained anxiety and depression for many.
And that comparison to psychological torture methods, the white torture idea, that came up again and again in what residents themselves said.
It did. And the parallel makes sense, unfortunately. Those methods often rely on inescapable, repetitive sensory input that destroys the victim's sense of control over their environment and undermines their perception of reality. The hum, by being invisible, untraceable, and impossible to block out, it achieved that same kind of effect almost organically. It took away that basic human need for rest and safety within your own four walls.
What about the impact on more vulnerable people? children, the elderly.
Yeah, the fear was definitely magnified for those groups. Parents were incredibly worried about kids who were constantly complaining of nausea or couldn't concentrate in school. Their developing nervous systems are just more sensitive to that kind of constant environmental stressor.
And for older residents.
For some elderly residents, that constant low buzzing, it sometimes led to this terrifying fear that maybe they were the problem, that they were losing their grip, maybe confusing the hum with tinnitus or some other age-related hearing issue. It just compounded their isolation and fear, made them doubt their own senses. Hashtag 4.2 alternative theories of origin. And because the political situation was gridlocked and the science wasn't giving clear answers about Zug Island, those alternative theories about where the hum came from, they never really went away. Geologists, for instance, kept exploring those underground possibilities.
Right, the geophysical stuff. Besides just general microseismic activity, were there more specific ideas about the bedrock or underground structures?
Yeah, they kicked around some interesting ideas. One was the concept of massive natural organ pipes, like vertical shafts or maybe large caverns hidden beneath the riverbed. The idea was these could resonate powerfully with ambient industrial noise or even natural vibrations, amplifying certain very low frequencies up into that infrasound range that bothered people.
And that could explain the variability.
Potentially, yeah. If these underground structures periodically filled with water or shifted slightly with sediment, that might explain why the hum's intensity changed dramatically over time, maybe independent of what Zug Island was doing on any given day. It paints this picture of the hum being this bizarre mashup of human industry and the Earth's own hidden architecture.
And then way over on the other end of the spectrum, you had the really dramatic military and conspiracy theories still bubbling up. How did ordinary people connect those kinds of high-tech, frankly outlandish ideas with their day-to-day suffering?
Well, for a lot of people, the sheer invisibility and untraceability of the problem just felt like it had to have some kind of sophisticated, secret origin. It didn't feel like normal pollution.
So secret tests.
That was a common theme. Discussions often revolves around military testing, maybe linked to the U.S. Navy's use of extremely low-frequency ELF radio waves.
For submarine communication, right?
Exactly. Those ELF signals are used to communicate with subs deep underwater, and they operate at incredibly low frequencies, low enough potentially to be felt as vibration over large distances. So the idea was maybe some rogue or classified system, perhaps testing how these waves propagate across the Great Lakes, was accidentally bathing Windsor in these harmful vibrations.
And the power involved seemed to match the effect.
Yeah, the sheer power needed for that kind of large-scale communication seemed, to some, to align with how profoundly disruptive the hum felt. It didn't feel small or localized.
But the scientific community, even the ones struggling to solve the hum, they always kept another possibility on the table: mass psychogenic illness.
Yeah, that's the really challenging one, but you have to consider it. The theory isn't that people were making it up, but more that. Okay, maybe there was an objective underlying low-frequency sound. Perhaps it's just a normal, persistent industrial rumble from Zug Island or elsewhere that had always been there. But then because of the stress, because of media reports focusing on symptoms like nausea and headaches, people started unconsciously expecting to feel those things. Their brains, already on high alert, started interpreting that ordinary background rumble as the sinister hum, and the power of suggestion led to shared physical symptoms across the community.
Like a feedback loop of anxiety and physical response.
Sort of. A complex interplay between a real environmental trigger and a collective psychological response. But you can imagine, for the residents who were genuinely suffering debilitating physical effects, suggesting it was partly psychogenic felt incredibly dismissive, insulting even. It was seen as equating their very real pain with mass hysteria.
Yeah, that's a tough line to walk. It highlighted that fundamental gap between trying to measure something objectively and respecting people's subjective experience of suffering.
Exactly. It became the ultimate point of division, really. Hashtag 4.3, a worldwide mystery.
Now, for the people in Windsor fighting this invisible thing day in and day out, there was this one piece of information that must have been both terrifying and maybe strangely validating. They weren't alone.
Right. The realization dawned that this wasn't just a Windsor problem. The sources confirmed that very similar, unexplained low-frequency sounds have plagued communities all over the globe.
Which really changed the narrative, didn't it?
It absolutely did. It elevated the Windsor Hum from being, potentially just a local industrial pollution dispute across a border into part of this significant, weird international phenomenon. Knowing others were suffering identical symptoms, that confirmed the sound was real, that they weren't imagining it.
But
It also introduced this really alarming possibility that the mystery might be fundamentally intractable. Maybe it was part of something much bigger, much weirder than just Zug Island's factories.
what other places were mentioned in the reports? Where else has this happened?
Well, the most famous comparison is probably the Taos Hum in Taos, New Mexico.
Yeah.
That's been going on intermittently since the 1990s. Decades. And residents there report the exact same things. Low-frequency drone, trouble sleeping, that feeling of internal pressure or vibration. Then you've got reports from Bristol in England, where locals described a persistent low hum that sounded very much like the mechanical drone people heard in Windsor. And Largs in Scotland is another place often cited.
And the common factors in all these cases, what ties them together?
It's strikingly similar experiences across the board, always low frequency, often intermittent or variable, usually more noticeable at night, extremely difficult to record reliably with standard equipment, and absolutely devastating to the mental and physical health of the subset of the population who can perceive it.
So the connection kind of suggested Windsor's problem wasn't unique, maybe not even uniquely tied to Zug Island.
It suggested it was part of a bigger conversation, really. Maybe about the limits of our built environment, the noise pollution we usually ignore, and maybe even the limits of human perception itself. Perhaps these hums are sounds that have always been there, masked by other noises, and only now, for various reasons, are they becoming perceptible to some people.
For the Windsor residents, though, hearing about toes, struggling for decades without a clear solution, that must have felt incredibly discouraging.
Deeply pessimistic, yeah. It felt like they were potentially fighting this global mystery, this curse almost, not just a localized factory issue that could be fixed with enough political will.
If the world's best acoustic experts and years of government studies couldn't solve the Taos hum, what real hope was there for Windsor, stuck in this political tug-of-war between two countries?
Exactly. It made the hum feel almost inevitable, like this force that just defied easy answers, defied local politics, defied even modern science. It took on a life of its own.
So, after nearly a solid decade of this relentless torment for so many people, something kind of unexpected happened around 2020. The constant flood of complaints started to slow down, then really dwindle, and for many residents, the noise just faded away.
Yeah, it was a pretty dramatic shift. And this sudden, widespread relief lined up almost perfectly with some major global and economic changes happening at the time. Specifically, it coincided directly with operations being significantly scaled back on Zug Island.
Ah, the prime suspect went quiet.
Pretty much. Changes in global demand for steel, other economic factors, led to a slowdown in production over there. Heavy machinery, like those big blast furnaces and coke ovens, went quiet, or at least operated much less intensely for a period. And for thousands of Windsor residents, the link felt absolutely clear. The island's industry quieted down, and the hum finally disappeared.
Cause and effect seemed pretty obvious to them.
Too many, yes. It felt like confirmation.
The relief wasn't total, was it? And there's still a lot of ambiguity about whether it's truly gone.
No, definitely not universal. And that's crucial. Some residents insisted, and some still insist they can still hear it. Maybe not as strong, maybe not as constant, but it's still there, rising up on certain quiet nights like this. This ghostly reminder.
And that lingering perception, the fact that not everyone agrees it's totally gone, must mean the psychological impact hasn't just vanished either.
Not at all. For those still hearing it, reports of its total disappearance can feel dismissive, invalidating their ongoing suffering. The anxiety doesn't just switch off overnight.
So what was the final verdict from the scientific experts when things got quieter? Did they finally say, okay, mystery solved, it was Zug Island?
No, absolutely not. The scientific community remained pretty cautious, skeptical about declaring victory just yet. While that correlation between the Zug Island slowdown and the reduction in complaints was undeniably compelling.
A strong clue.
A very strong clue, yes. But they still considered it primarily a working theory, not a solved mystery. Remember how hard the hum always was to measure consistently?
Right, chasing the ghost.
Without consistent, long-term, high-quality monitoring before the slowdown and after, you can't scientifically prove cause and effect beyond doubt. So the quiet was seen by many experts as possibly just a pause, a temporary retreat driven by economic factors.
Oh.
It didn't necessarily mean that other potential sources like the geological ones were completely ruled out. The case wasn't officially closed. Hashtag tag 5.2 the hum as folklore.
So even now, with the hum mostly quiet for many, its legacy seems totally secure. It's really embedded itself in the local history of Windsor, hasn't it? It's become this modern urban legend, but one built on very real suffering, political frustration, and all those unanswered scientific questions.
Oh, it's absolutely a powerful piece of civic folklore now. For a lot of people in Windsor, the hum stands as the ultimate symbol of, well, industrial indifference. The idea that a huge corporation across the border could impact the health and quality of life for an entire community for a decade, seemingly with impunity because of geography and politics.
A cautionary tale about cross-border issues.
Definitely. A stark reminder of how easily things can get bogged down, how powerless citizens can feel when facing that kind of political failure.
And those divisions we talked about earlier, the people who heard it versus those who didn't, the arguments over whether it was real, those seem baked into the legend now, too.
That's a huge part of its enduring power, I think. That fracture remains in the community's memory. The gap between those who were intensely physically tormented and those who slipped right through it, completely unaware. It really exposed what the sources called the fractures of perception and belief.
How hard it is to agree on reality when something is invisible and subjective.
Exactly. The story is powerful because it has everything. Industry, technology, politics, human psychology, the unreliability of our own senses. The hum forced everyone to confront the fact that really profound mysteries can hide in plain sight, even in our modern, supposedly hyper-monitored world. So yeah, we're left with this fundamental tension at the heart of the Windsor Hum story. Was it just industrial pollution carried efficiently across a river? Was it some complex geological resonance phenomenon? Was it a psychological feedback loop amplified by stress and suggestion? Or maybe some messy combination of all three?
We still don't know for sure.
We don't. Despite all our advanced technology, despite years of investigation and international media attention, this unseen, low-frequency force managed to torment a community for the better part of a decade. And it defied any absolute explanation, leaving behind this legacy of division, doubt, and unanswered questions.
It's such a potent reminder, isn't it, of how vulnerable we can be. Even in a world we think we have mapped and measured, with satellites and data ruling everything, our own senses can be unreliable, and science sometimes just hits a wall when trying to capture something intangible.
Right. The hum was real enough to destroy people's sleep, force families to sell their homes, wreck relationships. Yet it was slippery enough to escape our best efforts to definitively pin it down.
So the ultimate legacy here, maybe it's less about finding the one specific answer to what caused the hum, and more about the deeper questions it forces us and you listening to think about.
Exactly. It leaves you with this final thought to mull over. When you're confronted by some invisible force, something that directly attacks your well-being, your ability to rest, how much do you really trust your own senses, especially if others don't experience it? And maybe more profoundly, how do we as individuals and communities learn to live with deep mysteries that just refuse to be solved? Mysteries that leave us forever wondering what was really vibrating just beneath the surface of ordinary life?